November 15th, 1941. 30 kilometers west of Moscow. The temperature had dropped to -18 Celsius overnight, turning the autumn mud into a frozen landscape that crunched under every footstep. Major Ivan Dmitrievich Yakubovsky stood in the Commandny Punkt, the command bunker, studying a map that told a story of desperation. Red Army defensive positions formed a thin arc around Moscow, stretched to breaking point by 3 months of German advance. Blue arrows marked Wehrmacht panzer divisions that had pushed to within artillery range of the Kremlin. The map's scale showed what everyone already knew. The capital of the Soviet Union was within days of falling. Yakubovsky commanded the 3rd Battalion, 4th Guards Tank Brigade. On paper, his battalion consisted of 32 T-34 medium tanks, the most advanced armored vehicle in the world when it worked. In reality, he had 21 operational tanks, the rest destroyed or broken down during the fighting retreat from Smolensk. His crews were exhausted. His supply situation was catastrophic. And now, the mud that had slowed the German advance for weeks was about to become an even worse enemy. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. The Rasputitsa had arrived right on schedule. The Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads, when autumn rains turned Russian soil into bottomless quagmire that could swallow entire armies. For 3 weeks, the mud had been Moscow's best defense. German tanks bogged down. Trucks sank to their axles. Supply columns moved at walking pace or didn't move at all. The Wehrmacht's lightning advance had become a crawl through paste that clung to everything and stopped nothing from moving efficiently. But now the temperature was dropping. Soon the mud would freeze into iron-hard ruts and ridges that would break suspensions and shatter tracks. And when that happened, German mobility would return. Yakubovsky had seen the intelligence reports. Aerial reconnaissance showed German tank battalions repositioning for a final push. The plan was obvious. Wait for the ground to freeze solid, then punch through Soviet lines with concentrated armor before defensive positions could be reinforced. It was good tactics. It would probably work. Unless Yakubovsky could figure out how to keep his T-34s mobile in conditions that would immobilize everything else. The problem was simple physics. Tank tracks distributed weight across their surface area, but even that wasn't enough in the transitional period when mud began freezing. The top layer would freeze hard, while the subsurface remained soft. Tracks would break through the frozen crust and sink into the mud beneath, creating a trap where tanks had enough traction to move, but not enough to prevent sinking deeper with every meter. The T-34's wide tracks gave it advantage over German panzers, but advantage wasn't enough. He needed solution. Yakubovsky had been a tank officer since 1932. He had commanded a platoon during the Spanish Civil War, testing Soviet armor against fascist forces in a conflict that previewed the current war. He had fought in the Soviet-Finnish War, learning hard lessons about winter combat in conditions that made the current situation look mild. He had survived the initial German invasion through a combination of tactical skill, mechanical knowledge, and willingness to improvise when regulations failed to match battlefield reality. That willingness to improvise had earned him both promotions and reprimands. Soviet military doctrine valued initiative in theory, but punished deviation from approved methods in practice. The idea came to him while watching a supply truck struggle past the command bunker. The truck's rear wheels were wrapped in chains for traction, a standard winter modification. But the chains weren't helping much in the half-frozen mud. They cut through the surface crust, but couldn't gain purchase in the slush beneath. What if, Yakubovsky thought, you could increase the surface area of the track without increasing weight? something that would spread the load even more, floating the tank across the frozen crust instead of breaking through it. He walked to the battalion motor pool, a collection of camouflaged tents and dug-in positions where his maintenance crews worked around the clock, keeping the T-34s operational. His senior mechanic, Starshina Pavel Grigoriev, was elbow-deep in an engine compartment, replacing an oil pump that had failed during the night. Grigoriev had been maintaining tanks since before Yakubovsky joined the army. He could diagnose engine problems by sound, repair transmissions in total darkness, and fabricate replacement parts from scrap metal and determination. If anyone could turn a half-formed idea into working solution, it was Grigoriev. Yakubovsky explained his concept. Take truck tires, cut them into strips, weld or bolt them to the tank tracks. The rubber would increase surface area, spread the weight, and provide flexible cushion that could conform to the irregular frozen surface. Grigoriev listened, his oil-stained hands still holding the oil pump, his face showing the careful consideration of a craftsman evaluating a design problem. "Comrade Major, it could work. The rubber would distribute pressure better than steel, might even reduce track wear on frozen ground. But we would need authorization from brigade technical staff. Modification of standard equipment requires approval from—" Yakubovsky cut him off. "How long to modify one tank? Just to test the concept?" Grigoriev calculated mentally, his eyes moving as he worked through the logistics. "We have truck tires from destroyed supply vehicles, cutting and attaching them. Maybe 6 hours if we work through the night. Assuming we can weld in the cold. Assuming the metal doesn't become too brittle. Assuming 6 hours. Do it. T-34 number 12. It has the newest tracks, best for testing. Start now." Grigoriev's expression shifted from consideration to concern. "Comrade Major, unauthorized modification of combat equipment is violation of—" "I know what it violates, Starshina. I also know that in 6 days, German panzers will attack, and our tanks will be stuck in frozen ruts while they maneuver around us. Which violation concerns you more?" Grigoriev nodded slowly. He had served long enough to understand that regulations existed to maintain order in garrison, but survival in combat required different calculations. "We will need to work quietly. If brigade command discovers unauthorized modifications before we can demonstrate effectiveness. Then we work quietly. Select your best 2 men. No one else needs to know until we have results." That night, while the rest of the battalion slept in whatever shelter they could find, 3 men worked in the motor pool under canvas tarps that blocked the light from their welding torches. They cut truck tires into strips approximately 20 centimeters wide and 1 meter long. They drilled holes through the rubber and through the gaps in the tank tracks. They used whatever fasteners they could scavenge, bolts, wire, even welding where possible, though welding rubber to steel was exercise in improvisation rather than proper metallurgy. By dawn on November 16th, T-34 number 12 looked like it had been attacked by a deranged tire factory. Strips of black rubber hung from every third track link, giving the tank the appearance of wearing improvised snowshoes. The crew thought it looked ridiculous. Grigoriev thought it looked like court-martial evidence. Yakubovsky thought it looked like a chance. The test run happened at 0700 hours, before the rest of the battalion stirred. Yakubovsky personally commanded the modified tank, with his regular driver, Sergeant Dmitry Volkov, at the controls. They drove into an area of particularly difficult terrain, a field where the night's freeze had created a treacherous surface of hard crust over soft mud. A standard T-34 had attempted to cross this field yesterday and became hopelessly stuck, requiring 4 hours and another tank to extract it. Volkov advanced slowly, feeling the terrain through the controls. The modified tracks made a strange slapping sound as the rubber strips hit the ground. For the first 20 meters, nothing seemed different. Then they reached the section where yesterday's tank had bogged down. Volkov maintained steady power. The T-34 rolled forward without hesitation. The rubber strips spread the load exactly as Yakubovsky had theorized, keeping the tank on top of the frozen crust instead of breaking through. They crossed the entire field, a distance of 300 meters, in 3 minutes. No bogging down, no loss of traction, no struggle. Yakubovsky keyed his radio, calling the motor pool. Grigoriev, start modifying every operational tank in the battalion. We have 4 days before the German attack. I want 20 tanks with tire modifications by November 20th. The response came after a pause. Comrade Major, I must formally inform you that unauthorized equipment modification is prohibited under Article 194 of Military Technical Regulations. I am required to report. You are required to follow orders, Starshina. Modify the tanks. Yes, Comrade Major, but I am placing my objection on record. Your objection is noted and ignored. Begin work. The next 3 days became a controlled race against time and regulation. Grigoriev's maintenance crews worked 18-hour shifts, modifying tanks as quietly as possible while conducting routine maintenance as cover. They scrounged tires from every destroyed vehicle within 10 kilometers. They improvised fastening methods, discovering that a combination of through bolts and spot welds worked better than either method alone. They tested different rubber strip widths, finding that 20-centimeter strips provided optimal balance between surface area and flexibility. By November 19th, 18 T-34s wore the tire modifications. The remaining 3 tanks had track damage too severe to risk modification. Yakubovsky's battalion now had a capability no other Soviet unit possessed. His tanks could maneuver across frozen mud that would stop standard vehicles. In the fluid defensive battles around Moscow, mobility meant survival. It might also mean victory. The modifications did not go unnoticed. On November 19th, at 1400 hours, Yakubovsky received a curt message ordering him to report immediately to brigade headquarters. He knew what was coming. Someone had reported the unauthorized modifications. Now he would face either commendation or court-martial, depending on whether his superiors valued innovation or regulation more highly. Brigade headquarters occupied a reinforced bunker 5 kilometers behind the front lines. Yakubovsky descended the wooden steps into the underground command post, where maps covered every wall and radio operators maintained constant communication with forward units. Brigade Commander Colonel Andrei Pavlovich Kravchenko stood at the main map table, his stocky frame radiating the controlled fury of an officer who had just discovered his subordinate had broken regulations. Kravchenko spoke without preamble. Major Yakubovsky, I have received reports that your battalion has conducted unauthorized modifications to combat equipment. Specifically, that you have attached rubber materials to tank tracks without technical approval or authorization from higher command. Is this correct? Yakubovsky stood at attention. Yes, Comrade Colonel. I ordered modifications to improve mobility in current terrain conditions. You ordered. Kravchenko's voice was flat. Without consultation, without authorization, without regard for regulations that exist specifically to prevent poorly conceived field modifications from damaging equipment we cannot replace. Do you understand that modification of tank tracks affects weight distribution, mechanical stress on drive sprockets, and suspension loading? Do you understand that improper modification could cause catastrophic mechanical failure in combat? Yes, Comrade Colonel. I understand the risks. I also understand that without improved traction, our tanks will be immobile when the Germans attack. Immobile tanks are destroyed tanks. I judge the modification risk to be less than the tactical risk. Kravchenko's expression didn't change. Your judgment is not relevant. Regulations exist for reason. Equipment modifications require approval from technical staff who understand engineering consequences. You are tank commander, not engineer. Your job is to fight with the equipment you are issued, not redesign it based on your amateur theories. Yakubovsky kept his voice level. Comrade Colonel, I tested the modification extensively. The improved traction is significant. The mechanical stress is manageable. I have data showing... You have data showing violation of military regulations. Article 194 is explicit. Unauthorized modification of combat equipment is prohibited. The penalty is specified. Kravchenko paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Court-martial. Reduction in rank. Possibly worse, given the paranoid atmosphere where any deviation could be interpreted as sabotage. Before Yakubovsky could respond, another voice interrupted from the doorway. Before you court-martial your best battalion commander, Andrei Pavlovich, perhaps you should see what his modifications can do. Everyone turned. General Dmitry Lelyushenko, commander of the 30th Army, entered the bunker with the casual authority of an officer who had already survived 3 impossible situations and expected to survive several more. Lelyushenko was a tank officer's general, a man who had commanded armor units since the 1930s and understood both the capabilities and limitations of armored warfare. He walked to the map table and looked directly at Yakubovsky. Major, I have read the report about your tire modifications. I have also read the reconnaissance summary showing German panzer divisions repositioning for attack within 48 hours. Explain to me, in simple terms, why your modification matters. Yakubovsky chose his words carefully. Comrade General, the ground is currently frozen on top with mud beneath. Standard tracks break through the frozen crust and lose traction. The rubber modification increases surface area, keeping tanks on top of the crust. This provides superior mobility in current conditions. When Germans attack, my battalion can maneuver where their panzers cannot. We can conduct flanking attacks, rapid repositioning, pursuit of penetrations. Mobility is decisive advantage. Lelyushenko nodded slowly. And if your modification causes mechanical failure during combat? Then I have lost tanks I would have lost anyway to immobility. But I believe the modification works. I have tested it personally. The crews have confidence in it. And right now, Comrade General, confidence and mobility may be the only advantages we have. The bunker fell silent. Lelyushenko studied the map, his fingers tracing the defensive positions and probable German attack routes. Finally, he looked at Kravchenko. Andrei Pavlovich, your objection is noted and correct. Major Yakubovsky violated regulations. However, we are 30 kilometers from losing Moscow. The situation calls for initiative, even initiative that breaks regulations. I am taking responsibility for this decision. The modifications will continue. If they fail, the blame falls on me. If they succeed, the credit goes to Major Yakubovsky. Kravchenko's jaw tightened, but he knew better than to argue with an army commander. Yes, Comrade General, but I request that technical staff examine the modifications to identify any mechanical problems we can address before combat. Reasonable. Major Yakubovsky, you will cooperate fully with technical inspection. If problems are found, you will correct them. Dismissed. Yakubovsky saluted and left the bunker, feeling the weight of reprieve mixed with increased pressure. He had bought time and authorization, but now the modifications had to work. Failure would vindicate Kravchenko's objection and probably end Yakubovsky's career. Success would validate the risk. There was no middle ground. The technical inspection happened that evening. 3 engineers from brigade technical staff examined the modified tanks with the skeptical thoroughness of men looking for problems to justify their opposition. They measured bolt strength. They calculated additional weight. They examined weld quality. They tested rubber durability in freezing temperatures. After 4 hours, the senior engineer, a captain with engineering degree from Leningrad Polytechnic Institute, delivered his assessment. The modifications are crude but functional. The additional weight is negligible, approximately 180 kilograms per tank, well within design tolerances. The fastening method is improvised but adequate for short-term use. The rubber will degrade in extended cold weather, probably becoming brittle and cracking within 2 to 3 weeks. But for immediate tactical employment, the modifications should perform as claimed. I recommend monitoring for track tension changes and drive sprocket wear. Otherwise, the concept is sound. Yakubovsky felt relief he didn't show. The engineers had given reluctant approval. Now the modifications would stand or fall based on combat performance. The German attack began at 04:30 hours on November 21, 1941. Artillery bombardment announced the offensive, shells screaming overhead and exploding across Soviet positions in carefully coordinated fires designed to suppress defenders and create lanes for armored advance. At 05:20 hours, German panzers rolled forward, Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs advancing in company columns toward Red Army defensive positions that had been hastily prepared in frozen ground. Yakubovsky's battalion occupied positions on the northern flank of the defensive sector, hull down behind frozen earthworks that provided cover for the tank turrets while concealing the hull. His orders were simple: contain any penetration, prevent flanking maneuver, maintain cohesion with adjacent units. Standard defensive doctrine against superior enemy force. The Germans advanced confidently. They had intelligence showing Soviet tank units were road-bound due to terrain conditions. Their plan assumed they could maneuver around static Soviet positions, penetrate rear areas, and force defensive collapse. It was good plan based on accurate intelligence. It didn't account for tire modifications. At 05:50 hours, a German panzer company attempted to flank the Soviet position by moving through an area of frozen mud that intelligence had assessed as impassable to heavy armor. The German company commander assumed the flanking route would be undefended precisely because it was impassable. He was half right. The route was impassable to his panzers. Their narrow tracks broke through the frozen crust within 200 meters. Within 10 minutes, 8 German tanks were bogged down, crews frantically trying to extract vehicles that sank deeper with every attempt to reverse. Yakubovsky saw the opportunity immediately. He ordered 3 T-34s to advance across the frozen field on an intercept course. His modified tanks moved at 30 kilometers per hour across terrain where German panzers couldn't move at all. The geometry of the situation was brutal. Static German tanks trying to extract themselves from mud versus mobile Soviet tanks approaching from their flank. The engagement was decided before the first shot was fired. The T-34s opened fire at 800 meters, their 76.2-meter guns punching through the side armor of German panzers that couldn't maneuver to present frontal protection. Within 4 minutes, all 8 German tanks were burning or abandoned. The German company commander, watching through binoculars from a position that hadn't yet bogged down, immediately ordered retreat. His intelligence had been wrong. Soviet tanks were not immobile. His flanking maneuver had become a death trap. The pattern repeated throughout the day. German units attempted to maneuver through terrain they assessed as difficult but passable. They bogged down in the transitional frozen mud. Yakubovsky's modified T-34s moved across the same terrain with impunity, engaging German tanks from flanks and rear while the panzers struggled with traction. By evening, Yakubovsky's battalion had destroyed or disabled 34 German tanks, while losing only 2 T-34s to mechanical breakdown and 1 to enemy fire. The kill ratio was unprecedented. The tactical impact extended beyond simple numbers. German armored units began avoiding terrain that might bog them down, restricting their maneuver to established roads and firm ground. This predictability made them vulnerable to Soviet defensive planning. If Germans could only move on roads, Soviet defenses could concentrate on road approaches. The tire modifications had eliminated German tactical flexibility. Reports of the engagement reached higher headquarters with remarkable speed. By November 22nd, Army-level staff officers were analyzing Yakubovsky's tactics. By November 23rd, orders went out to other tank units to implement similar modifications if materials were available. By November 24th, NKVD investigators arrived at Yakubovsky's command post to determine whether the unauthorized modifications constituted sabotage or innovation. The NKVD investigation was thorough and terrifying. Captain Mikhail Sokolov, a political officer with the dead eyes of a man who had signed too many execution orders, questioned Yakubovsky for 6 hours. Where did the idea come from? Who approved it? Why wasn't authorization sought? Was it coincidence that the modifications used materials that could be interpreted as deliberate degradation of combat effectiveness? The questions probed for hidden meanings, searching for evidence of intent to damage Soviet military capability under guise of improvement. Yakubovsky answered each question with factual precision, providing dates, names, technical details, combat results. He had documentation. He had witness statements from crews. He had battlefield assessments from company commanders. Most importantly, he had results that couldn't be argued with. 34 enemy tanks destroyed. Defensive line held. German attack blunted. Numbers didn't lie, even to the NKVD. Captain Sokolov concluded his investigation with a report that praised Yakubovsky's tactical initiative and creative adaptation to battlefield conditions, while noting procedural irregularities that should be addressed through proper channels in future. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a warning. You succeeded this time. Don't try it again without authorization. But the real judgment came from an unexpected source. On November 28th, Yakubovsky received orders to report to Western Front headquarters in Moscow. He traveled to the capital expecting either commendation or condemnation, never quite sure which direction Soviet military politics would turn. He arrived at headquarters and was escorted to an office where Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commander of Western Front and the man responsible for defending Moscow, sat behind a desk covered in situation maps. Zhukov looked up from the maps and studied Yakubovsky with the clinical assessment of a surgeon examining a patient. Major Yakubovsky, I have read reports of your tire modifications. I have also read reports that you implemented these modifications without authorization, in violation of technical regulations, and despite warnings from your maintenance staff. Is this accurate? Yes, Comrade Marshal. Why? The question was simple. The answer was complicated. Yakubovsky chose directness. Comrade Marshal, regulations exist to maintain standardization and prevent poorly conceived modifications. But regulations cannot anticipate every battlefield condition. I saw a tactical problem. I developed a solution. I tested it. It worked. I understand I violated procedure. But the alternative was watching my tanks become immobile while Germans maneuvered around us. Zhukov nodded slowly. I fought in the Civil War, the Spanish War, the Finnish War, and now this war. I have seen many officers who follow regulations perfectly and achieve nothing. I have seen fewer officers who break regulations intelligently and achieve victory. You are the second type. This is valuable, but it is also dangerous. He stood and walked to the window overlooking Moscow's damaged streets. The problem with initiative is that it cannot be standardized. If every officer modified equipment based on personal theories, we would have chaos. Maintenance would be impossible. Supply would be impossible. The Army would dissolve into a collection of improvised units without coherent capability. This is why regulations exist. Yakubovsky remained silent, sensing that Zhukov was working through something beyond a simple reprimand. Zhukov continued. However, if every officer followed regulations regardless of tactical reality, we would lose battles that could be won. The tension between initiative and standardization is an eternal problem in military organizations. Smart commanders learn to balance both. He turned back to Yakubovsky. Your tire modifications worked because you understood the specific tactical problem and designed a specific solution. You tested before implementing. You documented results. You achieved measurable success. This is intelligent initiative. But you also created precedent that other officers might misapply. Some fool will now decide he can modify his tanks based on equally clever ideas that actually ruin the equipment. Zhukov returned to his desk and picked up a document. I am issuing formal commendation for your actions on November 21st. I am also issuing formal reprimand for violation of technical regulations. Both will appear in your service record. This ensures that other officers understand initiative is valued when it succeeds, but procedure violations have consequences. Do you understand? Yes, Comrade Marshal. Good. Now, I have a question about the technical details of your modification. The engineers tell me the rubber strips will degrade within 2 to 3 weeks in current cold. Is this accurate? Yes, Comrade Marshal. The rubber becomes brittle in extreme cold. We are already seeing cracks in the tire strips after 1 week of use. We estimate another week or 10 days of operational effectiveness. Then the modifications will need to be replaced or removed. Zhukov smiled, a cold expression without warmth. 1 week or 10 days. By then, either we will have held Moscow or we will have lost it. Either way, your modification will have served its purpose. Sometimes temporary solutions are sufficient if they bridge critical moments. I want you to document your modification method in sufficient detail that other units can replicate it if needed. Work with technical staff to create proper implementation guidelines. Make your improvisation into doctrine. Dismissed. Yakubovsky saluted and left, feeling the strange combination of vindication and warning that characterized Soviet military culture. He had succeeded. He had been praised. He had also been reminded that success did not eliminate consequences for breaking rules. The tire modifications remained on Yakubovsky's tanks for another 2 weeks before the rubber degraded to uselessness. By that time, the ground had frozen solid enough that standard tracks provided adequate traction. The tactical window where the modifications provided advantage had closed. But during those 2 critical weeks, Yakubovsky's battalion destroyed 97 German tanks while losing 11 of their own. The casualty exchange rate was extraordinary. More importantly, his battalion had prevented multiple German breakthrough attempts at critical moments when the defense of Moscow hung by increasingly thin margins. Other Soviet units attempted to replicate the modifications with mixed results. Some succeeded, following Yakubovsky's documented procedures and achieving similar mobility improvements. Others failed, either through poor implementation or different terrain conditions, where the modification provided no advantage. By January 1942, as winter fully set in and snow covered the frozen mud, the tire modifications became obsolete. The tactical problem they solved had changed into a different problem requiring different solutions. Yakubovsky continued commanding the 3rd Battalion through the winter battles around Moscow. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in February 1942 and given command of the entire 4th Guards Tank Brigade in April. His reputation as an innovative tactical commander spread through the tank officer community. Young officers studied his methods. Senior officers debated whether his success came from genius or luck. The truth, as usual, was more complicated. Years later, after the war, military historians would analyze the Moscow counteroffensive and identify multiple factors that contributed to Soviet success. The arrival of Siberian divisions, the German logistical collapse, the Soviet industrial mobilization, the weather. All of these factors mattered. But buried in tactical reports and unit histories was another factor that historians rarely emphasized: small innovations at battalion level that gave Soviet forces marginal advantages at critical moments. Yakubovsky's tire modification was one of dozens of such innovations. Individually, none was decisive. Collectively, they accumulated into a larger pattern of Soviet tactical adaptation that German forces couldn't match. The German army in 1941 was technologically superior, tactically proficient, and operationally brilliant. But it was also doctrinally rigid. German officers followed proven methods that had worked in Poland and France. When those methods encountered problems, the response was to apply more of the same methods with greater intensity. Soviet officers, especially mid-level commanders like Jakubowski, couldn't match German proficiency. But they could improvise. They could adapt. They could try unconventional solutions because conventional solutions clearly weren't working. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Soviet forces were consistently beaten in set-piece battles during 1941 and early 1942. But they learned faster than Germans did. They adapted tactics more quickly. They tried strange solutions that sometimes worked brilliantly and sometimes failed catastrophically, but always generated information about what worked and what didn't. By 1943, Soviet tactical doctrine had evolved beyond German ability to counter. The army that had been smashed in June 1941 had become the army that would capture Berlin in May 1945. Jakubowski's tire modification was a tiny part of this larger transformation. It was one battalion commander's solution to one tactical problem in one 2-week period. But it represented something larger. It represented an army learning to think differently. An army where junior officers were willing to break regulations to solve problems. An army where innovation, even crude, improvised innovation, was eventually valued more than procedural compliance. The modification itself was forgotten by most of the army within months. No formal doctrine emerged. No technical manual described the method. A few grainy photographs survived showing T-34s with rubber strips on their tracks, usually misidentified in archives as improvised winter modifications without understanding the specific tactical purpose. Jakubowski himself rarely mentioned it in post-war interviews, considering it a minor episode in a longer military career. But in 1979, a Soviet military historian researching tactical innovations during the Battle of Moscow discovered Jakubowski's original after-action reports in the archives. The historian, Colonel Anatoly Kirillov, interviewed Jakubowski, who was by then a retired major general living in Moscow. The interview lasted 3 hours, covering not just the tire modification, but the larger context of tactical innovation under pressure. Kirillov asked the question that historians always ask. If you could go back to November 1941, knowing what you know now, would you still implement the unauthorized modification despite the risks? Jakubowski's answer was immediate. Of course, the question isn't whether I violated regulations. The question is whether I solved the tactical problem. Regulations exist to guide action in normal circumstances. But we were not in normal circumstances. We were 30 kilometers from losing Moscow. When you are that close to catastrophic defeat, regulations become less important than results. Kirillov pressed further. What about the other officers who tried to replicate your modification and failed? What about the risk of encouraging undisciplined improvisation? Jakubowski leaned back in his chair, the retired general with 4 decades to reflect on decisions made in the desperate urgency of combat. The risk of undisciplined improvisation is real. I have seen officers make stupid modifications that destroyed equipment and got people killed. But I have also seen officers follow regulations precisely and achieve nothing while their units were destroyed. The question is not whether to allow initiative. The question is how to cultivate intelligent initiative while preventing foolish initiative. That is difficult balance, maybe impossible balance, but it is necessary balance. He paused, looking out the window at Moscow's skyline, so different from the damaged city he had defended 38 years earlier. What I learned in November 1941 is that victory often depends on someone being willing to take responsibility for unauthorized action. The system cannot always adapt fast enough to approve every tactical innovation. Sometimes you must act first and seek forgiveness later. This is risky. It can end your career. It can get people killed. But sometimes it is necessary, and the officers who survive are the ones who learn when to follow regulations and when to break them. That interview became the basis for a journal article published in 1980 in Voenno-Исторический Journal, the Soviet Military History Journal. The article described Yakubovsky's tire modification in technical detail and analyzed it as case study in tactical innovation. The article reached a limited audience of Soviet military professionals and academics. Few outside the Soviet military establishment ever read it. But within the Soviet military, the story became teaching example. Not because the tire modification itself was revolutionary, but because it illustrated principles of tactical adaptation that every officer needed to understand. See the problem clearly. Design a solution specific to that problem. Test before implementing. Document results. Take responsibility for consequences. These principles transcended the specific historical example and became part of how Soviet officers thought about tactical problems. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and archives opened to Western researchers, military historians discovered thousands of similar stories. Small unit commanders solving tactical problems through improvised innovation. Most innovations failed. Some succeeded. A few, like Yakubovsky's tire modification, succeeded at exactly the right moment to have impact beyond their apparent scale. The tire strips themselves survived only in photographs and fading memories, but the principle they represented survived in military culture. The idea that junior officers have responsibility to solve tactical problems, even if solving those problems requires bending or breaking regulations. This idea is dangerous. It creates risk of chaos and indiscipline, but it also creates possibility of adaptation and innovation that rigid hierarchies cannot produce. Ivan Dmitrievich Yakubovsky died in 1987 at age 73, having lived long enough to see the Soviet Union approach collapse, but not long enough to witness its dissolution. His obituary in Krasnaya Zvezda, the Soviet military newspaper, mentioned his service during the Battle of Moscow, his subsequent commands during the war, and his post-war career reaching the rank of Major General. It did not mention tire modifications, unauthorized equipment changes, or arguments with NKVD investigators. But in the Russian Army today, at the General Staff Academy, where future commanders study military history, there is a brief case study in the curriculum covering tactical innovation under pressure. The case study analyzes 3 examples of junior officers solving tactical problems through unauthorized initiative. One example is the tire modification implemented by then Major Yakubovsky in November 1941 outside Moscow. The case study asks students to evaluate the decision. Was Yakubovsky right to violate regulations? Should Kravchenko have court-martialed him? Should Zhukov have done more to either punish or reward the behavior? The point of the case study is not to provide answers. The point is to force future officers to think about the tension between innovation and discipline, initiative and regulation, tactical success and institutional risk. There are no perfect answers, only choices made in specific circumstances with incomplete information and uncertain consequences. Yakubovsky made his choice in November 1941. He chose to violate regulations in order to solve a tactical problem. He succeeded. Others might have made the same choice and failed. The difference between success and failure was partly skill, partly luck, partly timing. What mattered was the willingness to take responsibility for the choice. To say, I saw a problem, I developed a solution, I tested it, I implemented it, I accept the consequences, whatever they are. That willingness to accept responsibility for initiative, even unauthorized initiative, is what distinguished effective officers from merely competent ones. The German officers Jakubowski fought against were competent. They were well-trained, tactically proficient, and operationally skilled. But they were also bound by doctrine that didn't adapt quickly to changing conditions. When their standard tactics encountered problems, they applied more of the same tactics with greater intensity. They rarely tried radically different approaches because their system didn't reward improvisation. Their system rewarded following proven methods that had worked before. Jakubowski's system wasn't better, it was just different. It tolerated more chaos, accepted more risk, and sometimes rewarded officers who broke regulations in pursuit of tactical success. This created problems: undisciplined units, equipment failures, confusion. But it also created opportunities for adaptation that rigid systems couldn't produce. In the end, the Battle of Moscow was decided by many factors. But one small factor was that Soviet battalion commanders were willing to weld truck tires to tank tracks in violation of regulations, and German battalion commanders were not willing to take equivalent risks. That difference, multiplied across thousands of small tactical situations, accumulated into operational and strategic consequences. The tire trick worked for 2 weeks. Then it stopped working as conditions changed. But 2 weeks in November 1941 was long enough to help hold Moscow. And holding Moscow was long enough to survive until winter fully arrived. And surviving until winter was long enough for the strategic balance to shift. Small things matter in war, especially when they happen at exactly the right moment. Jakubowski understood this. He also understood the risk of what he had done. His final words to Colonel Kirillov in the 1979 interview captured this understanding perfectly. They banned his modifications. They threatened him with court-martial. They investigated him for sabotage. And then, when his improvised solution destroyed 97 German tanks in 2 weeks, they quietly rewarded him while officially reprimanding him. This is how armies learn. Through officers willing to risk their careers to solve tactical problems. Through commanders smart enough to recognize success even when it violates regulations. Through systems that somehow balance innovation and discipline without fully understanding how to do either correctly. It is messy. It is dangerous. It is imperfect. But it is how we survived when we should have lost.